Warhammer sells a Infernus Marines and paint set for those wanting to get into the hobby. It retails for about 20 quid in the UK, and it's something that you can pick up in most Warhammer stores. It could very easily be your first foray into Warhammer building and painting. So I wanted to find out how good I could get these models looking without spending any other money. Was it an absolute shambles, or did I do them justice? Let's find out. Now, as standard, I use a task lamp, which I'm going to use because I think you should be able to find a suitably well-lit space to work. If your workspace is dark, then you're going to have to be near a window or find a desk lamp or something to light your work. I have a beautiful grey cutting mat which I work on, but ultimately, and perhaps rather unfortunately, this doesn't have any impact on my painting, so I'm going to leave that in place and assume you're working on something. Whether that's old newspaper or just directly on the family heirloom dining table, it's your funeral. I also use a wet palette normally. A wet what, you ask? I have a video about that, so save it for later. I'm going to not use my wet palette for this since I think it changes the way you work with paints, so let's go back to basics with a regular old dry palette. In fact, I'll use the shoddy white plastic you get in the box. It'll be like Blue Peter or something. That should keep this as close to any beginner starting out as possible. For the record, I'm 41 and I like to paint plastic toys in my spare time. If you're new to the hobby, welcome. You too will find yourself deeply immersed in no time at all. All I'm saying is, don't do anything that might stop the pocket money coming in because you're going to need all of it. I'm also going to assume that you have something to wipe this crappy ass brush on, whether that's kitchen towel, an old rag, mum's curtain offcuts, or a wee cloth. Let's not sweat that detail right now. Or ever. Okay, first issue, there's no primer. Wondering what primer is? I have a video for that. We actually have a grand total of 5 paints in teeny toty wee pots. Black, white, blue, gold, a brown shade, and a bloody texture paint, which is basically paint with glue and sand in it. Second issue, this brush is going to be absolutely 100% guaranteed garbage. I know that from experience, so let's see how long before I lose my mind trying to keep that point sharp. Merely picking up the brush has had me vomit up a little bit of sick in my mouth, so make sure you do your painting before dinner. The silly little men come on a silly little sprue, and I noticed on the back of the box it says tools required, so I have to allow myself some clippers here to get the Marines off the sprues. I have recently spent an absolute metric fuck ton on a pair of God Hand clippers, but fortunately I still have loads of beginner type clippers that the poors use, so I figured I'd grab them and see how badly I could do this. I also decided that I didn't want to use a craft knife, since if you're younger, then mum or dad are not going to let you run about with a blade, and so we'll just do without. The reality is, this will only be obvious on 1 or 2 bits anyway, since a lot of the cut marks are going to be covered up. If clipping things off sprues gets you all hot and bothered, I have a video on that as part of my beginner series. It's properly riveting, so make sure you go and check it out after. I proceeded to build the Marines with the instructions on the back of the box. It's not rocket science, but do make sure you follow the order since a couple of bits need to be done in a certain way for them to fit right, and these little pegs don't like to come out of the holes after they've gone in. Also, be careful. I managed to push way too hard with my incredibly strong, powerful and muscular adult man hands, and I managed to snap one of the wee pegs clean off. So I allowed myself a bit of glue to get that sorted, otherwise we'd be down to 2 Marines without even touching the paint. If this happens to you, well, that's it I'm afraid. You've failed the hobby and someone will appear at your door to requisition all of your Warhammer stuff within 2 to 3 working days. Sorry about that. Once all 3 Marines were built, I had to base coat them. Normally I would prime them with a spray can like an absolute legend, but in the absence of that, black paint will have to do, so Abaddon Black, time to shine. Incidentally, I have a wildly fascinating video on priming your minis, so once again, something fun to watch after this, eh? Painting the black on was brutal, and probably did a good amount to pretty much scupper the already struggling brush from the offset, but I tried to get as good coverage as I could, given that this was the challenge I'd set myself. I noticed, even if I thought about mixing water with the paint, it would just start pooling and not adhering to the plastic, so really, they would have been much better primed, but here we are. Once primed, or covered in black paint, I guess, I composed myself. I made a small but not insignificant sacrifice to Khorne, the Blood God and Lord of Skulls, and then I figured I'd start the actual painting bit. Because the starter brush is made of synthetic fibres, presumably to keep costs down, it started to hook at the end very quickly. So the tip did not keep, and anything requiring any level of precision became rather difficult. And hey, guess what? I have a video on paintbrushes too, so yada yada, check it out. The blue required a good double coat to really come up well. Make sure as you paint to have in mind the wise words of Uncle Duncan, aka the Roadster, aka that guy who used to work at Warhammer but has his own painting academy now. He used to, and probably still does, talk about how important it is to use at least 2 thinner coats instead of slopping on your paint like you're building a mud hut.
Always remember, having multiple thin coats is better than one thick coat.
The gold went on fairly well, and having a black base coat underneath obviously made a big difference to how well the gold looked. Again, a couple of coats to get it good, but I knew this would be shaded with the Agrax Earthshade anyway. Now I thought I'd get pretty clever here and try and do some volumetric highlights with a lighter blue. So I mixed some white into the blue, but I think the results were a bit hit or miss. Mostly because the paint would dry so quickly on the plastic palette that mixing the same ratio became taxing, and the brush would hold so little paint that even the most basics of blends and layering became absolutely impossible. Even more white in the mix, and I figured I'd try for some edge highlights, despite the brush almost certainly not being good enough. I did make the best of it, I think, but if you've ever tried to use your phone with mittens on, that's kind of what it felt like. Since I'd edged the blue, I thought I'd edge the black, and so a mix of black and white meant that grey would stand out enough for an edge highlight on the gun. Again, not ideal in the absence of a grey paint, but not the worst solution. I also had a great idea here to do the leather parts with a texture from the grey, and then an Agrax Earthshade wash would make them look leathery and brown. But I realised later that this was not as simple as it had seemed when I thought of it. The wash was next, so it went on the gold parts to dull them and recess shade them a bit. Nothing wild to report here, it behaved as expected. Sadly, the wash over the leather parts did not do enough, and without doing 10 coats of this stuff, I was going to get nowhere. Another great idea, I'd mix some Agrax Earthshade with white to get a light brown, and then use that to do the edges. The problem here is the dilution of the shade meant that there was not enough pigment to make a convincingly different hue, and so I was left with a somewhat messy leather holster part. Oh dear, look at me go. Next up was the white for the shoulder pad detail and some spot highlights on the gun just to help it look a bit shinier. The dot on the corner technique sometimes makes things look a bit nicer. I was really hoping for salvation at this point. I touched up a bit of black on the shoes, and then I decided I'd also mix some black with more water to try and get a dark Null Oil type black shade, which I guess sort of worked, and it allowed me to darken some of the recesses. Then, using the same bloody brush, I had to apply texture paint, and instead of take the mini off the base like someone who knew what he was doing, I figured I'd just blast the texture paint on all around the shoes, and of course managed to spaff some on the shoes too. Luckily my quick thinking cat-like reflexes kicked in, and I could mix in some water and sort of style it out to look like some of the sand or dust or whatever yellow mess was on the ground had basically been gathering. Oh, and you know what? It's basically weathering, so don't judge me because at least I did it, okay? Where's your starter set? I sorted some of the gold areas with more paint just to clean them up, and then once the texture paint had dried, it got a shade of Agrax just to provide some depth and make it a little bit dirtier. Voila! The great stuff. Okay, so after the first miniature was done, it occurred to me that there would be far more value in showing you the additional things you might want to pick up to improve your painting as a newcomer to the hobby, rather than just struggle through all 3 of these Space Marines with the world's most inappropriate brush and the fastest drying paint known to man. So for the second Space Marine, I figured let's see if using my preferred brush and a proper wet palette would make any difference. First up, the brush has a larger belly for holding paint and water, and it's natural fibre, so it maintains a tip far more easily. As for the wet palette, it's something you might want to look into. I have a video on them, of course, but I would suggest that you get used to using the paint, understanding how to dilute it and work with it on a dry palette first, so that when you do decide to invest or make a wet palette, you know what's going to happen when you use it, as opposed to just blindly going in and assuming it will work. Anyway, I'm going to do some more mixing this time round, so I've put the palette on screen so that you can see how that plays into things. I tried to more or less keep to the same recipe, so you'll see the relevant parts appear in basically the same order, but if you can, I'd like you to take a moment to appreciate how lovely that brush is and how much neater and easier it was for me to get all the right things going on. You'll note that I sometimes wipe my brush on my thumb to take excess paint off. This is something that all pro painters do, and if you don't come away from a painting session with a thumb that looks like it's been up Jackson Pollock's arsehole, then you're not doing it properly. I based this one after removing the Mini, so no need to pretend like I wanted battle dust on the shoes, which was good. Just blasting on the texture paint with the starter brush, not my good one, and then plonking the Mini on and covering the extra bit. In the end, I decided I also wanted to try and make the end of the flamer look a bit burnt too, so I went to town with some shading. Did it work? Of course not, but listen, 10 out of 10 for trying, okay? I'm here to have some fun, what about you? Anyway, here it is, a mostly also pretty terribly painted Marine, but perhaps slightly tighter in all the right places. Can I say that? Lastly, the third Mini. I realised that I could paint it by using all the paints I have at my disposal to show you how much difference that makes, but honestly, I don't think it's productive, and I don't have all the time in the world, nor do you have all the same paints as I do, so I thought how about we find out if it's possible to do something a bit more fancy using just the paints in the box. So what if we try a little non-metallic metal? That's metallic or shiny effect, but without using metallic paints. It's basically what people do to show off their painting skills, and it's massively elitist and something people love to wax lyrical about when it comes to technique. That way you can see that it's not necessarily always about having the exact right colours for these things, and it's more about learning the techniques and understanding how to mix your paints and blend things, and also being superior to everybody else, because that's what really counts when it comes to painting. Lucky for us, we have a black, an almost white, and a blue, which means we can probably get a reasonable silvery looking non-metallic metal on the go. The process is simple, he says, having done it about 5 times ever. You build a gradient up to the highlights wherever the reflections would be if it was made of metal, and then you hope for the best. And if it doesn't turn out, you go onto Discord or the internet and you ask people what you did wrong, and you repeat it until you get something that looks a bit like metal if you sort of squint, and you just take it from there. Honestly, I'm surprised, mostly that I managed to get anything half decent looking out of the starter set, but that on my first go the NMM came out alright. So there you have it. We've painted one Marine with the starter set only. It's not great, but it's not really awful, is it? It'll get you on the tabletop if that's where you want to go. We've also painted one Marine with a better brush, and it came out a little better, although again, given our lack of paints, it could be better. So my conclusion is thus: if you pick up this box, and only this box, you're not going to have the best hobby experience. You'll get very quickly frustrated with the brush, and you'll find the lack of primer means you're stumbling at even the first hurdle. Here's what else you need to pick up if you've got this in your basket. 1. Some clippers to get the parts off the sprue. This is essential. 2. A spray primer, if you can. It needs to be used outside, but it will make that first coat on the miniature much quicker, smoother, and more evenly covered. 3. A better brush. For the love of all things plastic, get a better brush. If you can afford it, get a nice natural hair or mixed Kolinsky and synthetic hair brush. There are plenty brands out there doing good ones, and some are affordable. It's the one thing that will make painting so much more enjoyable for you, and if you treat it well, it'll last plenty long enough to make the investment worth it. If you want to invest even further, here are the things I'd get next. Number 4, I'd consider a wet palette. Although this is maybe a little specialist for the beginner, but it will help stop your paints drying up so quickly. Number 5, a craft knife and or mold line remover. This will allow you to clean those ghastly sprue gates off your minis before you put paint onto them. And number 6, some more paints. I know this was probably what you expected first, but the reality is more paints won't make you a better painter. That said, you probably want a dark and lighter brown for the leather parts, a silver metallic for silver things, and well, you can pick whatever colours you really like after that. And so now we're here. You've spent more money, and I've waffled on for a while about my hobby. Did we learn anything? Who knows? I certainly learned that I'm not as good a painter as I thought. I also learned that Warhammer scrimp on the starter brushes, and I've learned that more paint isn't the answer to better paint jobs. If you've learned anything, let me know in the comments, but do it after you've pressed the like button and the subscribe button because it's free to do both and it makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside.